Greetings, one and all. I am Baba the Storyteller, your resident griot or oral historian, and welcome to another episode of Profiles in History. Today we're profiling Juneteenth and the big lie that has shadowed it since its inception. But before we get into that, I have to make a confession to all of you. I might be a bit biased, overly enthusiastic, and slightly partisan when it comes to speaking on Juneteenth, but it's not my fault. You see, I was born in Texas, Central Texas, to be exact. I grew up really hyped about Juneteenth gatherings. If I'm being really honest, I knew very little about the holiday as a child. As a kid, my excitement was over the fact that it was the only day in my life that I got to combine eating cake with drinking soda. Of course, I'm talking about that infamous red velvet cake and strawberry soda pop. It wasn't until my adolescence that I began to gain a deeper understanding of the history and significance of Juneteenth. I find what usually serves as history here in the Americas is actually propagandized mythology, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's jump into what we all have gathered here for, Juneteenth and the big lie. Growing up in Texas, most of our Juneteenth celebrations were usually planned by local churches. Very few were ever secular in nature. The largest ones I ever attended were in Houston, about 3 hours drive southeast of my hometown of Killeen. I used to wonder why we never celebrated in the capital city of Austin, which was only about 40-minute drive from my hometown. But it wasn't until I was about, 12, maybe 13, that I found out that it was a formerly enslaved man everyone called Pastor Yates, who organized the community back in 1872 to purchase land. This land is where we were gathering to celebrate Juneteenth. They named it Emancipation Park. Full disclosure here, I probably could have known this fact much sooner as a child had it not been for my preoccupation with the food and fun of Juneteenth. I don't think I've ever seen so much food in one place. Okay, over the decades, those celebrations ebbed and flowed. There were some years when there may have only been a few dozen in attendance, and there were years that we didn't travel to Houston. We had small, very small Juneteenth celebrations at our local church. The mythology surrounding Juneteenth that I later found out was a lie, a big lie. It has to do with the popular narrative that the enslaved in Galveston, Texas, knew nothing about their freedom until General Granger came down from New Orleans on June 19, 1865, and delivered his infamous 5 Orders address. The third order read thusly: "The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freed are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere." Okay, I'm going to need y'all to bear with me for a second. I gotta gather myself so I don't say the wrong thing. First of all, Texas was one of the most inhumane, sadistic states in the Confederacy. And yes, the inhumanity heaped on the enslaved has been chronicled extensively. And so I won't need to go into that here. But to believe that enslaved men, women, and children in Galveston were these indolent, ignorant souls not active in their own fight for freedom is beyond delusional. Okay, I might be getting ahead of myself here. Let's just look at the popular narrative surrounding Juneteenth, and you'll see where I'm going. The popular narrative says that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation January 1, 1863, freeing the enslaved in all treasonous states that had seceded from the Union. By the way, slave states that hadn't seceded, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, they weren't affected by the Emancipation Proclamation. The institution of slavery remained intact in those states. But that's a topic for another session. Now, back to that distorted history of Black men, women, and children, Galveston not knowing they were free until good old General Granger arrived on the scene. Let's get more of that. This is going to be a bit of a mind twist, but I need y'all to stay with me. Okay? Listen with your heart, not your ears. Dig into the core of your humanity and hear me. Human beings do not see themselves as anything but free, living under oppressive conditions. Let me say that again. And please receive what I am saying. Human beings have never and will never see themselves as anything but free, recognizing they are existing under oppressive conditions. The big lie is a tool of propaganda that seeks to strip African Americans of any agency in our struggle for freedom. Eurocentric mythology places the wand-wielding hand of white America over the heads of enslaved with an abracadabra, you're free now, magical incantation. And here's where I have to remind myself to breathe. Give me a second. I am not the first to do battle with the big lie of Black folks as inanimate objects on the sidelines of history waiting for someone to hand us our freedom. In 1935, one of the greatest intellectuals born in this nation, W.B. Du Bois, published a manuscript titled Black Reconstruction in America. In this manuscript, there's an essay, The Propaganda of History. I would highly recommend anyone seeking to right the wrongs of our current mythology read it. But in this piece, Du Bois writes about how the narrative surrounding the participation of Black folks in the Civil War was propagandized in a way that sought to exclude us from our rightful place in conversations of history. He really digs deep into fighting the popular notion of the time that we, Black folks, were not considered human beings. It's really worth a read. Make time for it. But let me be really clear in what I'm saying, and you can quote me here. The truth of the history of this nation is that we, African Americans, freed ourselves and at the same time saved the Union from defeat. This statement shouldn't be controversial because it is a fact supported by overwhelming evidence. The Union was suffering losses at an incredible rate. The Confederacy was quite literally on the verge of destroying the United States. But don't take my word for it. Let me share a little story with you. Abraham Lincoln actually wrote the Emancipation Proclamation around July of 1862 and was ready to push it out to the public. His Secretary of State, William Seward, stopped him. Now, I can see y'all sitting there wondering, why? Well, let me give you an actual quote from Seward to Lincoln. Mr. President, I approve of the proclamation, but I question the expediency of its issue at this juncture. The depression of the public mind consequent upon our repeated reverses is so great that I fear the effect of so important a step. It may be viewed as the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help, the government stretching forth its hands to Ethiopia instead of Ethiopia stretching forth her hands to the government. Okay, I apologize for the accent. I have no idea what Secretary of State Seward actually sounded like. All right, quickly, let's just break apart and digest Seward's quote because I see how some of it can be a bit confusing, like when he says, our repeated reverses. What does that mean? Let me put it another way. Our repeated butt whoopings by the Confederates. Is that a little more clear for y'all? Another part that might deserve some clarifying is when Seward mentions Ethiopia. He's not talking about Ethiopia, y'all. He's using the word Ethiopia to symbolize Black America, both free and enslaved. Are y'all still with me? Just got to check in every few minutes just to make sure. Okay? So what Seward was telling Lincoln at the time was that the optics were really bad at the moment to issue the Emancipation Proclamation because it would look like Northern whites were begging Black folks for help in saving them from losing to the Confederacy. I think that's clear enough. Seward wanted to wait for a win in the Civil War before issuing the proclamation. I looked over some of the records and found a period from August to September of 1862 where there were 13 battles fought, of which the Union only won 2. Just in case you're trying to do the math on this, I'll tell you, it wasn't looking so good for Old Abe and the Union. The win that this propaganda campaign needed so that it wouldn't look like the proclamation was a beggar's bowl held out by Lincoln came with the Confederate defeat at the Battle of Antietam. Lincoln's official issuance of the proclamation happened on January 1st of 1863. Oh, okay, and by the way, the proclamation only offered freedom to those enslaved in the treasonous states of the Confederacy. In the states that didn't secede, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, well, they were allowed to maintain their institutions of slavery. It wasn't until the 13th Amendment that the actual issue of enslaving human beings was addressed politically. Oh, I just remembered something really funny. I hate taking detours. I apologize. Well, funny to me anyway. We all know that Lincoln's proclamation turned the tide of the war in favor of the Union. The Confederacy found itself back on its heels and being handed defeat after defeat after defeat by this new Union Army that was now reinforced on the battlefields with highly motivated Black men. Guess what the Confederacy did? Okay, y'all are going to love this. No one ever talks about this. So, January, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. March of that same year, the Confederacy passed a law. Sorry, I get a little... the Confederacy passed a law. I like to call it the Anti-Emancipation Proclamation. The Confederates issued a proclamation of their own, begging Black folks to come and fight on their side. Yes, they did. I can feel y'all shaking your heads in disbelief. But here's the kicker. This is how steeped in a parasitic white supremacist ideology they were. They issued this Anti-Emancipation Proclamation and specified that freedom was not on the table for any enslaved or formerly enslaved willing to come fight on their side. Once again, if you want to stop here, pause for a little reflection, I would not blame you. But I need to get back to my Lincoln Seward story. I want y'all to just take a moment to think about this. You're in a war. You are losing said war. You need help desperately. But instead of executing the steps that would get you where you want to be, you back off because of how it might make you look. The optics. Como se dice en español? Increíble. Okay, we're going to return to Galveston and the big lie in a second, but I want to make sure everyone understands that prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, Black people were already fighting and serving in the Civil War. It was not in any official governmental capacity, but you had men, women, and even children functioning as spies for the Union, teamsters, cooks, fortification builders, and yes, armed resistors. I really want to take a detour here and talk about the history of the contraband, but those escaped enslaved people who served the Union cause before the Emancipation Proclamation, but I've got to stay on track here. And so let's save that for another profile in history. You know, the bizarre thing for me in this moment is that none of this history is hidden. I've had heated conversations with many over some of this history, only to discover that the person I'm engaging has never even read the Emancipation Proclamation. What's that quote attributed to Marcus Aurelius? How'd that quote go? The opinion of 10,000 men is of no value if none of them know anything about the subject. And anyway, there's an old adage that says, if you want to hide something from most people, then place it between the pages of a book. Let's get back to Galveston. First things first. I want you to use your own common sense here when I point something out. Contemporary mythology wants you to believe that the enslaved people of Galveston were in the dark about things happening in the Civil War, and specifically the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, Common sense, people. Galveston is a port city. Please don't make me have to explain what that means. Secondly, okay, and I know most of you already know this, but Texas borders Louisiana. The Union captured New Orleans in 1862. There is so much more to be said about this, and I'm leaving so much on the table. The Union used their position in Louisiana to lead attacks into Texas. During the war, let me add something here. Enslaved people in Texas would flee enslavement, another form of resistance, cross Union lines, and lend themselves to the cause. This is how interesting this gets. Many of these formerly enslaved Texans, let's make sure to include Galveston here, who had family and loved ones still under the yoke of slavery, would return to fight or attempt to free their family and loved ones. There were thousands of Harriet Tubmans all doing the same thing to bring others to freedom. To really understand this dynamic of enslaved, formerly enslaved, and free Blacks forming resistance movements, we should put a lens on what became known as the Rio Grande Exposition. This gets almost no attention in our talks about the Civil War. What was so important about the Union's Rio Grande Expedition? 5 Black regiments occupied the area of Texas around modern-day Brownsville from 1863 to the end of the war in 1865. What was their mission? Well, exportation of cotton was financing the Confederacy's treason. These Black troops were sent to disrupt the cotton trade, and disrupt it they did. The landing of Black regiments in Texas near the Brownsville area scared the mess out of these white secessionist communities. Newspapers from that era tell stories of mass hysteria and whites fleeing Texas, leaving those they had enslaved behind, as well as most of their belongings. Once again, I'm only scratching the surface here, and I hope this encourages many of you to do the same or do your own research. Quickly, let me share a map with you to illustrate my point. Here's Brownsville, on the Gulf, near where these Union troops landed. This invasion, as the Confederates wanted to call it, sent shockwaves up through San Antonio, Houston, and as far away as Austin. Are we really to believe that this same panic didn't make its way up north to Galveston? It did. I assure you. I can also guarantee that everyone in Galveston was talking about this. Here's a quote from a Texas newspaper from that time, the Houston Tri-Weekly Telegraph. "We and the entire country in great excitement. The majority of planters have removed their Negroes towards the interior, and many families have left them all behind in fleeing from the perils of invasion." So, from 1863 to 1865, these Black soldiers were wreaking havoc on the Confederacy from this area of Southeast Texas. Hold on. Let me think about this for a second. 1863 to 1865. Okay, when did General Granger arrive in Galveston for his famous announcement to the enslaved folks? Yeah, I think that was about 1865. Okay, so wait. Are we really supposed to believe that the Black folks in Galveston knew nothing about the war raging all around them, and they weren't being updated continuously while living in the area of a major port city? Please, let's give this lie the burial it deserves, and keep this in mind. Wherever, whenever people are suffering under any type of oppression, there will always, let me say this emphatically, there will always be resistance. And Galveston, the home of Juneteenth, was no exception, my friends. Another truth. There were Black Union troops marching through the streets and occupying Galveston days before Granger's arrival. You see where I'm going, right, with this, right? You see the theme here? So the big lie that we, African Americans, whether in Galveston or any other place in this nation, were not active in securing our own freedom is a destructive form of white supremacist propaganda and psychological warfare. that is meant to marginalize and often erase our role in the founding and upliftment of this nation. I've even heard from the mouths of people who should know better. You know, black folks fought on the side of the Confederacy also. Stop it. Stop the insanity. There's a saying, well, more of a proverb, that says, by opening their mouths, the ignorant are exposed. Okay, I didn't mean to venture down this path, but let me share something with y'all real quick. See this image? It's one of the images from the Civil War used in some schools, even today throughout the South, as proof that blacks fought on the side of the Confederacy. Now, let me share this next image. Oh, wait. Are you telling me that someone cropped out the Union officers standing next to what are believed to be some of the earliest black Union soldiers? Yes, yes, and yes. But Baba, why would anyone cut out the Union officer from the original photo? I'll give y'all time to think about that. I need to bring this to a close. I have a couple of thoughts I'd like to leave you with. I have many white friends, colleagues, and associates who ask me if Juneteenth is for African Americans to celebrate only. I find this question a little unnerving. Almost no one questions Black folks celebrating Independence Day, the 4th of July, a period when many of our ancestors were enslaved. I would put forth that Juneteenth is this nation's actual day of independence. It's the one day that everyone in this nation can point to as a time when this nation began putting into practice the lofty idealism of the freedom it espouses. And let me leave you with this thought. Please feel free to repeat it. Our African American ancestors freed themselves from the oppression of slavery and at the same time saved this nation from ruin. Thank you for your time and patience, and I hope I've shared something that was of value to you. I'm your griot, your oral historian, Baba the Storyteller. So until our paths cross again, which I'm fond of saying, Doni Doni, Kununi Benyagada, or little by little, the small bird manages to build its nest. See you all again soon.